All right, test tomorrow is 3.1 through 3.4. It's a lot of solving quadratics with our different techniques. So we'll have solve by using square roots, solve by factoring, solve by using the quadratic formula, solve by completing the square, and then some questions will also say solve using any method, so you could use any one of these methods that you want to use. And the test is also 13 questions. So I highlighted specific ones from the review that I want to go over that will see something similar to it on the test. If there's something that I didn't, a question that I didn't do in the review, you can just raise your hand and I'll go to it if I have time. But I want to make sure we get to the highlighted ones first, just because we'll see similar questions to those on the test tomorrow.
The ones highlighted are the ones we're going to be
Similar. They're good practice. So I just wanted to make sure we touch on everything that we'll see tomorrow, so I highlighted specific ones. So let's start with number 11. So we have to solve by factoring. So here are leading coefficients 1, so we can just factor normal. What are two factors of 4 that add to negative 4?
2.
Negative 2 and negative 2. So this would be x minus 2. You can either say squared because there's 2 of them, or x minus 2 times x minus 2. Now we're not just factoring, we have to solve. We need it to be x equals. So what would I do next? Set each one equal to 0. So x minus 2 equals 0 and x minus 2 equals 0. Then we just solve each little equation. So I'm going to add 2 to both sides. So x is equal to 2 and x is equal to 2. If it's the same number, you don't have to write it twice, but our answer here is 2. Any questions? Okay, I made up a number 13, so if you look on the board right below number 13, you don't have this question on the review, but it is good practice for the test, so I just want to make sure we do one. So here it says solve by factoring. If we solve something by factoring, it has to be equal to 0 first. So what should I do first? Subtract 15. We need to make it equal to 0. So we're going to move the 15 to the other side. So 2x squared minus x minus 15 is equal to 0. Now what should we do? Factor it how?
2x is in front of 1 and the next finally, right?
No, we can't factor it that way. And we can't factor it normally because we have a leading coefficient that's not 1. How would we factor here? No. Can I divide 1 by 2 or 15 by 2? No, so we don't have a GCF. Yeah. Awesome. We multiply the first times the last. So if we start with a leading coefficient that is not 1, you want to multiply the first times the last. So 2 times negative 15 is negative 30. Do we have two factors of negative 30 that add to negative 1?
6 and 5.
6 and 5. Which one's negative? Negative 6. Perfect. So this would be x minus 6 and x plus 5. What would we do next? Before I make them equal to 0, what do I have to remember to do? If I start by multiplying, what can I not forget? I have to divide. Don't forget, if you start by multiplying the first times the last, you have to remember to divide by that leading coefficient. So I'm going to divide by 2. Simplify if you can. So this one turns into x minus 3. If it doesn't simplify, move it in front of the x. This would be 2x plus 5. Now we can set them both equal to 0. So x minus 3 equals 0. 2x plus 5 equals 0. And from here we can solve. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. X is equal to 3. What do I do to solve the next one? Subtract 5. So 2x is equal to negative 5. And then divide by 2. So x is equal to negative 5 over 2. So these would be our two answers. All right, let's look at 18 right below. So here it says solve the equation using any method. If we have parentheses squared, we want to solve by using square roots. So I want to get that parentheses squared all by itself. So how would I move that minus 3 or that negative 3 to the other side? What do I do? Awesome, divide it. It's being multiplied to our parentheses, so to move it over, we divide. So we have p plus 2 squared is equal to negative 4. What do we do next? Square root both sides. So square rooting cancels out with the squared. So p plus 2 is equal to, what is the square root of negative 4? Plus or minus. Don't forget, anytime we take the square root of both sides, you need plus or minus, and then the negative turns into an I, and square root of 4 is 2, so plus or minus 2i. Now we have one last step, because we need it to be p equals. We need the variable all by itself. How would I move that plus 2 to the other side? Subtract 2. Can I combine negative 2 and 2i? No, they are not like terms, so we just leave it separate. So p is equal to negative 2 plus or minus 2i. All right, let's go to the next page. So 3.2, we had a lot of our imaginary complex operations where we had to add, subtract, or multiply our complex numbers. So for number 8, we're subtracting. What would I do first when subtracting? Distribute the negative, so it turns into a minus 15 and plus 7i. And then we have to be careful. Only real numbers can get added with real numbers. Only imaginary can get added to imaginary. So let's start by adding our real numbers first. What is 9 minus 15? Negative 6. And then what is 6i plus 7i? 13i. So this would be our answer. Make sure your real part comes first. Any questions? All right, 15. Here we're multiplying. How would I multiply these two? FOIL. So we start by multiplying the first. 10 times 10 is 100. Then the outsides, 10 times 7i, 70i. Negative 7i times 10, minus 70i. And then the last, negative 7i times 7i, minus 49i squared. What would we do next here? Change the I squared to negative 1. Well, what's negative 49 times negative 1? Positive 49. Now we can combine like terms. So you always want to change your I squared, then combine like terms. Start with the real parts. What's 100 plus 49? 149. Then our imaginary parts. What's 70i minus 70i? 0. They cancel out. So our answer is just 49. 149. So let's take a look at number 1 on 3.3. So here the directions say, solve the equation using square roots. Do I have a parentheses squared here yet? No. So I can't use square roots yet, but maybe I can make it a parentheses squared. Let's see if our left side is a perfect square. What are two factors of 121 that add to negative 22? Negative 11 and negative 11. Perfect. So this factors into w minus 11 squared equals 81. Now we have it set up perfect so we can solve using square roots. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So it cancels out with the squared. So I have w minus 11 is equal to what? Plus or minus 9. Don't forget the plus or minus. Again, the test is 12 or 13 questions, so each question is going to be about 8 points. So if you forget plus or minus, that's going to be 4 points off right there. It's half the question. Yeah, you forgot half the answer. So do not forget the plus or minus. Anytime you take the square root of both sides. What do I do next? Add 11. Remember, we want the variable all by itself, so got to move everything to the other side. We're going to add 11. Can I combine 11 and 9?
Yes.
Yeah, they're like terms. So let's do it separate. So I have w is equal to 11 plus 9, and w is equal to 11 minus 9. So what does w equal? 20 and 2. Awesome. Any questions there? All right, let's look at 9. So here, for 9 and 10, we're going to solve by completing the square. So solve by completing the square. What's the little formula that we use to complete the square? B over 2 squared. So for a question like 9, we want to distribute first. So I have q squared plus 6q is equal to 1. I'm going to leave the space here so I can complete the square. This space is where I put the b over 2 squared. What's my b? 6. So I have 6 over 2 squared. What's 6 over 2? 3. So 3 squared is what? 9. So I'm adding 9. What else do I have to do? Add it to the other side too. So in my parentheses squared, what am I going to put inside? Q and 3. So we take the two things that were squared here before we square them. So I have q plus 3. And then 1 plus 9 is 10. Does everybody see how we got that? We're all good so far. What would we do next to solve? Square root both sides. We got to get rid of that squared, so we're going to square root. So I have q plus 3 is equal to, what is the square root of 10? Or what is this equal to? What? Plus or minus square root 10. Let's just double check that we can't simplify the square root of 10. What are two factors of 10? 2 and 5. Do I have any pairs? No, so it doesn't simplify. What's the last step? Subtract 3. Can I combine 3 and square root 10? No. So q is equal to negative 3 plus or minus square root 10. So in here, we take the q, like our variable, and the number before we squared it. Okay, I'm going to practice a different one other than 10 over here. Let's say we had something like negative x squared is equal to 6x plus 4. And it said solve by completing the square. So what's the formula we use when we complete the square? B over 2 squared. What should I do first here? Add x squared. I want to add x squared to move it to the right side. We don't like solving or factoring when our leading coefficient is negative. So always just try to make it positive if you can. Move it to the other side or divide everything by -1. So let's add it to move it over. So I have 0 is equal to x squared plus 6x plus 4. What would I do next to complete the square? I can subtract 4. If you want to, you can make your equal 0 on the other side. A lot of the questions that we use, the equal 0 is always on the right. So if you want to keep it over there, that's fine too. So I'm going to subtract 4. So x squared plus 6x, I'm going to leave a space to complete the square, is equal to -4. So now I have my b over 2 squared. What's my b? 6. 6 over 2 squared. What's 6 over 2? So I have 3 squared, and what's 3 squared? 9. So I'm adding 9. What else do I need to do? Add it to the other side too. So what's going to go in my parentheses squared? X plus 3. The two things before we square it. So x plus 3. And then that's equal to, what's -4 plus 9? 5. What would we do next to solve? Square root both sides. So x plus 3 is equal to what? Plus or minus square root 5. And then what's the very last step? Subtract 3. Can I combine 3 and square root 5? Nope, so we can just leave it separate. So -3 plus or minus square root 5. All right, let's look at the ones down below. So 15. So a question like this, the directions might say solve using square roots. So what would I need to do to solve? Square root both sides. So always you want your square, that parenthesis squared all by itself. If it already is, then we can go ahead and take the square root of both sides. So it cancels out with the squared. X plus 9 is equal to what? Plus or minus 7. Perfect. What do we do next? Subtract 9. Can I combine -9 and 7? Yes. So we want to split this up. So I have x is equal to -9 plus 7. And x is equal to -9 minus 7. So x is equal to what? 2 and -16. So 18 says solve by factoring. What could we do first here? If I have two terms, what am I going to look for to factor? A GCF. Do I have a GCF? What's our GCF? If our GCF is just a number, you can divide everything by that number and get rid of it. You don't need it in your question. Just divide everything by your GCF, make the numbers smaller to help you out. So I have x squared minus 9 is equal to 0. Does x squared minus 9 factor into what? X plus 3 and? X minus 3. It's the difference of squares, our favorite. So it factors into x plus 3, x minus 3. What would we do next to solve? Set them each equal to 0. So x plus 3 equals 0 and x minus 3 equals 0. So x is equal to -3 and +3. I want to do one more question similar to this, but a little bit different. So I would definitely write this down. We had something kind of like this on the quiz, just so you understand the difference. So I'm going to call it 19. Let's say we had 2x squared is equal to 7x, and it said solve by factoring. If I had to solve something by factoring, what do I need it to be equal to? Is it equal to 0? So how do I make this equal to 0? Subtract 7x. So I have 2x squared minus 7x is equal to 0. Now I only have two terms here. How would I solve by factoring? Take out the GCF, which is what? X. So I'm going to divide them both by the GCF of x. That goes to the outside. We can't get rid of it if our GCF is a variable, so we need it in our answer. What am I left with when I take out that x? 2x minus 7. Now, just like we solved by factoring before, what would I do next? Set them both equal to 0. So x is equal to 0, and 2x minus 7 equals 0. So x is equal to 0 is already solved for us. Perfect. What would I do to solve the other one? Add 7 and divide by 2. So x is equal to 7 over 2 and 0. We got two answers here. So definitely I would write this down. All right, so let's take a look at 16. Now that we practiced all of our methods on solving, we can use whatever method we want here. So what would I do to solve? Awesome. Let's try to see if we could factor first, because factoring would probably be the easiest way. So let's multiply our first times our last. We have to multiply the first times the last if we're going to factor, because our leading coefficient's not 1. And we don't have a GCF to take out here either. If you had a GCF, you could try to take that out, make your number smaller, but we don't have one here. So we get negative 12. Do we have two factors of negative 12 that add to 6? Nope, we don't. So factoring doesn't work. What else could we do? We could complete the square, but our leading coefficient's not 1, so that would kind of throw a wrench in our plans when completing the square. What else could we do?
Add 4 to 0.
That would be completing the square. If our leading coefficient's not 1 and it doesn't factor, what do you think the best way to solve this would be? What did we just do for the last questions? Not the determinant ones, but before that. Quadratic formula. So if our leading coefficient's not 1, we'll probably have to use your quadratic formula. Quadratic formula will work every time, but remember on the test you just have to follow the directions. So if it says solve by factoring, don't use your quadratic formula. A quadratic formula will work every single time. So if you have the leading coefficient that's not 1, you'll want to solve by using your quadratic formula. So let's practice this one. We have our A, B, and C. So I have negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC over 2A. Make sure you know your quadratic formula for tomorrow. If you need to YouTube quadratic formula songs to make it stuck in your head, do that. But that would be the first thing I write down when I get the test, is the quadratic formula. Let's plug in. So negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 6 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 4 over 2 times 3. So negative 6 plus or minus the square root of, this will be 36, minus, what is 4 times 3? Negative 12 times negative 4? 48. So this would turn into a plus 48. So 36 plus 48. 84 over 6. So what would we do next? Awesome. Let's break down our square root. I'm going to write it over here so we have more room. So negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 84 over 6. Let's simplify our square root. What are 2 factors of 84? 4 and 21. 2 factors of 4, 2 and 2, and 2 factors of 21, 7 and 3. So what would get circled? The 2, so that comes to the outside, so negative 6 plus or minus 2 square root, what stays on the inside? 21 over 6. Now let's see if we can simplify it a little bit more. Are all 3 of our whole numbers divisible by the same thing? What? 2. So divide them all by 2. So this would be negative 3 plus or minus square root 21 over 3. So the other way that we could simplify this, which you don't have to, you could just leave it like this, but if you did negative 3 over 3 plus or minus square root 21 over 3. So that would be negative 1 plus or minus square root 21 over 3. But that would be the only other way that you could simplify it. I would just say this, leaving it like this is fine as one fraction. You just need to make sure if you're going to simplify, all 3 of the whole numbers have to be divisible by the same thing. All 3 whole numbers. You cannot divide into the radical. So let's look at 3.4. 3.4, we solved using the quadratic formula and finding the discriminant. So 2 different parts. When solving using the quadratic formula, our quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over what? 2a. Make sure you know the quadratic formula for your test tomorrow. There are at least 2 questions that say solve using the quadratic formula. So again, if every question is worth 8 points and you don't remember your quadratic formula, that's 16 points right there. So make sure you know the quadratic formula. Let's do number 4. So we want to label our A, B, and C before we start plugging it into our quadratic formula. What's our A?
4.
What's our B? Negative 3. And C? Negative 5. Let's plug it in. So my quadratic formula would be negative B. So negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 3 squared minus 4 times A times C, which would be 4 times 4 times 5, negative 5, over 2 times A, so 2 times 4. From here, after we plug it in, let's simplify. What's negative 3? Positive 3, so that would be 3 plus or minus. Negative 3 squared is 9. Minus 4 times 4 is what? 16. So negative 16 times negative 5. That would be 5 times 6 is 30. 5 plus 3 would be 80. So that would be positive 80. So we have 9 plus 80, which is 89 over 8. Let's see if we can simplify this. Always simplify your square root if you can. So square root of 89. What are 2 factors of 89? I don't think we have any. Yeah, we don't have any. So it doesn't simplify. So this would be our answer. That's it. Some of your quadratic formula questions will simplify, so it might be a little bit more work. Some won't. So just simplify as much as you can, and then you're done. So let's look at 7. For 7, can I just label my A, B, and C right away? Why not?
It's not equal.
It's got to be equal to 0. So what would I need to do to make it equal to 0? Add v squared. Perfect. So we have 0 is equal to v squared minus 10v plus 4. Now let's label our A, B, and C. What's our A?
1 squared.
1. Remember, it's the number in front, and if we don't have a coefficient in front, it would be 1. What's our B?
Negative 10.
-10. And C?
4.
4. So let's plug it in. We have negative B, so negative -10, plus or minus the square root of B squared. So that'd be -10 squared, minus 4 times A times C. So 4 times 1 times 4 over 2A. When A is 1. All right, let's simplify now. -10 turns into +10. -100 squared. Or I mean, -10 squared is 100. That's one step ahead of myself. -4 times 1 would be -4, and -4 times 4, -16. 100 minus 16,
94.
84. And then 2 times 1 is 2. What should I do next?
Divide by 2.
I can't divide into the radical. So first we want to see if we can simplify the square root of 84. What are 2 factors of 84? 42 and 2. 2 factors of 42? 21 and 2. And 2 factors of 21? 7 and 3. Do I have any pairs? 2 and 2. So we'd circle the 2. So what comes to the outside? 2. So 10 plus or minus 2. What stays on the inside? 21 over 2. Now, if all 3 of our whole numbers are divisible by the same thing, we can simplify. But you cannot divide into the radical. In that blue part, you can't simplify the radical by dividing it by 2. You can't divide a whole number into the radical. You have to make sure all 3 whole numbers are divisible by the same thing. Are all 3 whole numbers divisible by the same thing here? Yes. So let's divide them all by 2. So we have 5 plus or minus, it would be 1 square root 21, which is just square root 21, over 1. Do I need the 1 in the denominator there? No. So 5 plus or minus square root 21. So this was number 7. All right, let's look at 11. All right, for the discriminant questions, our formula for discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. And then a few important things that we need to know about our discriminant. If our discriminant is positive, that tells us that we have 2 real solutions. If our discriminant is 0, what does that tell us about our solutions? 1 real solution. And if our discriminant is negative, 2 imaginary solutions. So make sure you know this for the discriminant question. So looking at number 11, could I just label my A, B, and C right away?
No,
Why not?
because it's not equal to 0.
It's not equal to 0 and it's not in standard form. So how would I make it equal to 0 and in standard form? Add 12h to move it to the other side. Where's it going to go? After the 3h squared. So I have 0 is equal to 3h squared plus 12h plus 1. Now what's our A? 3. What's our B? 12. And C? 1. So let's find our discriminant. We have b squared minus 4ac. I'm going to write that up here. So 12 squared minus 4 times 3 times 1. What's 12 squared? 144. Minus, what's 4 times 3 times 1? And 144 minus 12? 132. So our discriminant is 132. What does that tell us about the number of solutions that we have? 2 real solutions. Make sure you include your discriminant and how many solutions you have. 2 real solutions. What should we do first for number 12? Subtract 3. Remember, we want it to be equal to 0 and in standard form. So I have negative 2x squared plus x minus 3 equals 0. So from here we can label, what's our A? What's our B? 1, and C? Negative 3. So I'm going to use the formula b squared minus 4ac. So from here I'm going to plug in my A, B, and C. So 1 squared minus 4 times A, which is negative 2, times C, which is negative 3. So 1 squared is just 1. Negative 4 times negative 2 is 8, and 8 times negative 3? Negative 24. What is 1 minus 24? Negative 23. So my discriminant is negative 23, but what does that tell me about the number and type of solutions? 2 imaginary solutions. Awesome.